The morning sun cast long shadows across the motor pool at Fort Hood, Texas, as Staff Sergeant Emma Rodriguez pulled her weathered pickup truck into the parking area. She wore faded work clothes, oil-stained jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, looking more like a civilian contractor than a soldier reporting for duty. At 29, her petite frame and quiet demeanor often led people to underestimate her, which had become both a burden and an advantage throughout her military career. Emma grabbed her small duffel bag from the truck bed and walked toward the main garage of the 1st Cavalry Division's motor pool complex. The facility was already busy with morning activities, mechanics working on various vehicles, the sound of air wrenches and diesel engines, and the familiar smell of motor oil and metal that had become oddly comforting to her over the past year. She'd specifically requested assignment to this motor pool, wanting something simple and routine after her last deployment. Working on trucks and Humvees was honest, straightforward work that didn't require the split-second life-or-death decisions that had dominated her previous assignments. After 18 months of medical leave and rehabilitation, she was ready to ease back into military life with something manageable. The motor pool sergeant, Staff Sergeant Mike Torres, looked up from a clipboard as she approached. He was a big man with grease-stained hands and the weathered look of someone who'd spent his career working on military vehicles. "You Rodriguez?" he asked, looking her up and down with obvious skepticism. "Yes, Sergeant, reporting for duty." Torres studied her civilian clothes and small stature with a frown. "You're the new mechanic they're sending me. You look like you weigh about 90 pounds soaking wet." "I can handle the work, Sergeant." What's your experience, fresh out of AIT?" Emma had been expecting this question, though she chose to answer it selectively. "I've worked on vehicles before. Different types, different environments." "That's pretty vague. What kind of vehicles?" "Helicopters mostly, but the mechanical principles are similar." Torres raised an eyebrow. "Helicopters, what unit were you with?" "I was with an aviation unit," Emma replied, keeping her answer deliberately general. "But I'm here to work on ground vehicles now." "Why the change? Aviation mechanics usually stay in aviation." Emma hesitated. The real answer was too complicated and too personal to share with someone she just met. "I wanted to try something different." Torres looked skeptical but didn't push further. "Well, Rodriguez, this isn't some fancy aircraft hangar. This is a motor pool where we fix real trucks that carry real soldiers. The work is dirty, the hours are long, and there's no room for prima donnas." "I understand, Sergeant." "Do you? Because I've seen too many soldiers who think motor pool work is beneath them. They show up with attitudes and last about a week before they're crying to transfer back to whatever cushy job they came from." Emma felt the familiar sting of assumption and prejudice, but she'd learned to let her work speak for itself rather than argue about capabilities. "I'm here to work, Sergeant. Whatever needs to be done." Torres led her into the main garage, where several soldiers were working on various vehicles. The bay was filled with Humvees, trucks, and armored vehicles in various stages of repair. The atmosphere was casual but focused, with soldiers calling out to each other about parts and procedures. "Listen up," Torres called out, his voice carrying over the noise of the garage. "This is Rodriguez. She's our new mechanic. Somebody show her where the tools are and get her started on something simple." A lanky private first class named Johnson approached them, wiping his hands on a rag. "Hey, Sarge, what's her background? She looks pretty new." "Says she worked on helicopters but wants to try trucks," Torres replied. "Start her on oil changes or something basic until we see what she can actually do." Johnson looked Emma up and down with the same skepticism she'd encountered from Torres. "Helicopters, huh? That's pretty different from working on these beasts. These trucks take some muscle to work on." "I'll manage," Emma said quietly. "Sure you will," Johnson said with a smirk. "Just don't hurt yourself trying to lift anything heavy. We'll take care of the real work." As Torres walked away to attend to other duties, Johnson led Emma to a workstation in the corner of the garage. "This is where we keep the basic tools," he said, gesturing to a beat-up toolbox. "Start with that Humvee over there. Needs an oil change and tire rotation. Think you can handle that?" "Yes." "Good. Try not to get too dirty. I know some people aren't used to real mechanical work." Emma nodded politely and began organizing the tools she'd need for the job. Around her, she could hear other soldiers making comments about the new girl and speculating about how long she'd last in the motor pool environment. "Bet she transfers out within a month," said one voice. "Look at her, she's tiny. How's she going to work on these heavy vehicles?" "Probably some officer's daughter getting an easy assignment." Emma had heard similar comments throughout her career, though usually they were followed by respect once people saw her actual capabilities. This time felt different, though. She wasn't here to prove herself or compete with anyone. She just wanted to do honest work in a calm environment while she continued recovering from experiences she wasn't ready to discuss. As she began working on the Humvee's oil change, Emma found the familiar rhythm of mechanical work soothing. Her hands moved efficiently through procedures she'd performed thousands of times, though on much more complex aircraft systems. The simple, predictable nature of the task was exactly what she needed right now. "Hey, Rodriguez," called Specialist Williams from across the garage. "You sure you know what you're doing over there? That drain plug can be tricky." "I've got it," Emma replied without looking up from her work. "Just saying, if you need help, ask one of the guys who's actually done this before." Emma continued working, ignoring the commentary from her new coworkers. She'd learned that proving herself through competence was more effective than arguing about assumptions. The oil change proceeded smoothly, and she moved on to the tire rotation with the same quiet efficiency. About an hour into her work, Sergeant Torres appeared at her workstation to check on her progress. He looked surprised to see that she'd completed both tasks correctly and was already moving on to a basic inspection of the vehicle's other systems. "Not bad, Rodriguez. You actually know what you're doing." "Thank you, Sergeant." "Where did you say you learned to work on vehicles?" "Various assignments," Emma answered vaguely. "You pick up skills over time." Torres studied her more carefully. "You know, there's something about the way you work that seems familiar, very systematic, very thorough. Reminds me of aircraft mechanics I've worked with." Emma tensed slightly, hoping Torres wouldn't press for more details about her background. "Maybe I just pay attention to detail." "Maybe? Well, keep it up. When you're done with that vehicle, Johnson has a list of other jobs that need doing." As Torres walked away, Emma reflected on her first morning at the motor pool. The work was exactly what she'd hoped for, straightforward, predictable, and free from the high-stakes pressure of her previous assignments. The skepticism from her coworkers was annoying but manageable, and she was confident that her competence would eventually earn their respect. What she hadn't anticipated was how much the familiar sounds and smells of a working garage would remind her of aircraft hangars, where she'd spent so much of her career. Every tool had a memory attached to it. Every mechanical procedure triggered recollections of different times and places where similar work had carried life-or-death consequences. Emma pushed those thoughts away and focused on the present task. This was her new reality, simple mechanical work in a safe environment where the biggest risk was getting her hands dirty. After everything she'd been through, that sounded perfect. As the morning progressed, she settled into the rhythm of motor pool work, letting the familiar comfort of mechanical procedures help her forget about the more complicated aspects of her military service. For now, she was just another soldier working on vehicles, and that was exactly what she needed to be. By the end of her first week at the motor pool, Emma had established a routine that suited her perfectly. She arrived early, worked quietly on whatever assignments she was given, and left promptly at the end of the duty day. Her coworkers had begun to accept her competence with basic mechanical tasks, though their comments still carried undertones of surprise that someone who looked so unassuming could be effective. The work itself was therapeutic. Emma found peace in the predictable nature of vehicle maintenance, the clear problem-solving requirements of mechanical repairs, and the satisfaction of restoring equipment to proper working condition. It was honest work that produced tangible results, unlike some of her previous assignments where success was measured in classified metrics she couldn't discuss. On Friday morning, Emma was assigned to work on a Humvee that had been giving the mechanics trouble for several days. According to the work order, the vehicle had an intermittent electrical problem that caused various systems to fail unpredictably. 3 different mechanics had attempted repairs without success, and the truck was scheduled to be sent to the depot for major work. "Rodriguez," called Sergeant Torres from across the garage, "I've got a job for you. That Humvee in Bay 3 has been driving us crazy for a week. Electrical problems we can't track down." Emma looked at the vehicle in question, a well-worn M1114 armored Humvee with obvious signs of hard use and multiple previous repairs. "What kind of electrical problems, Sergeant?" "Random system failures. Radio cuts out, lights go dead, instruments stop working. Happens at different times for no apparent reason. We've checked all the obvious stuff: battery, alternator, main, fuses. Nothing obvious wrong, but it keeps happening." "Has anyone checked the grounding system?" Torres looked surprised by the question. "Grounding system? That's pretty advanced troubleshooting, Rodriguez. You sure you know enough about electrical systems to work on that?" Emma had spent years working on aircraft electrical systems that were far more complex than anything found in ground vehicles, but she kept that information to herself. "I've done some electrical work. Ground faults can cause intermittent problems that are hard to track down." "Well, give it a shot. Worst case, you don't fix it and we send it to depot like we planned anyway." Emma began her diagnostic work systematically, using an approach she'd learned working on helicopter electrical systems where intermittent faults could be fatal in flight. She started with a comprehensive visual inspection of all wiring harnesses, looking for signs of chafing, corrosion, or improper repairs. Specialist Johnson wandered over to watch her work. "What are you doing, Rodriguez? We already checked all that stuff." "Looking for patterns," Emma replied, tracing a wire harness that ran along the vehicle's frame. "Intermittent electrical problems usually have predictable causes if you know what to look for." "Like what?" "Vibration damage, moisture intrusion, poor connections that only fail under specific conditions." Emma pointed to a section where the main wiring harness passed through a bulkhead. "This area looks suspicious. The harness is rubbing against sharp metal." Johnson looked where she was pointing but didn't see anything obvious. "Looks fine to me. That's how all these trucks are wired." Emma continued her inspection, following wiring paths and checking connection points with the methodical precision of someone who understood that small electrical problems could cascade into major system failures. After about an hour, she found what she was looking for: a ground strap that had been improperly repaired, creating an intermittent connection that would fail under vibration. "Found it," she announced, pointing to the faulty connection. Johnson examined the area she indicated. "That little thing, how can you tell that's the problem?" "See how the wire strands are corroded where they connect to the terminal, and look at the screw, it's loose and the threads are stripped. Every time the vehicle hits a bump, that connection opens and closes randomly." "So how do we fix it?" Emma was already gathering the materials she needed. "Replace the terminal, reroute the ground strap to a better connection point, and use proper hardware to secure it." The repair took about 30 minutes and required Emma to crawl under the vehicle to access the grounding point. As she worked, several other mechanics gathered to watch, curious about whether her diagnosis would prove correct. "Think that'll actually fix it?" asked Specialist Rodriguez, one of the more experienced mechanics. Should, Emma replied from under the vehicle. Ground faults are one of the most common causes of intermittent electrical problems. When she finished the repair, Emma started the vehicle and began testing all the electrical systems. Everything functioned normally, but the real test would come when the truck was driven and subjected to the vibrations that had caused the original failures. Take it for a test drive, suggested Tors, who had been watching the repair process with interest. Emma drove the Humvee around the base for 20 minutes, testing all systems under various conditions. Everything worked perfectly, with no sign of the electrical problems that had plagued the vehicle for weeks. When she returned to the motor pool, a small crowd of mechanics had gathered to see if the repair was successful. Emma parked the vehicle and demonstrated each of the electrical systems that had been failing intermittently. "Well, I'll be damned," said Johnson with genuine admiration. "She actually fixed it. We've been fighting with that thing for a week." Tors approached with obvious respect in his expression. "Nice work, Rodriguez. That was some pretty sophisticated troubleshooting. Where did you learn to diagnose electrical problems like that?" Emma felt the familiar tension of trying to explain her background without revealing details she wasn't ready to share. "You pick up things over time. Electrical principles are pretty much the same whether you're working on vehicles or aircraft. Aircraft electrical systems are usually more complex than vehicle systems," observed Specialist Martinez, who had previous experience with aviation units. "What kind of aircraft did you work on?" "Various types," Emma answered evasively. "But like I said, the principles are similar." Tors was studying her with growing curiosity. "Rodriguez, I'm starting to think there's more to your background than you're letting on. That level of diagnostic skill doesn't come from basic training." "I've had good teachers over the years, Sergeant." "What was your MOS before you came here?" Emma hesitated. Her actual military occupational specialty was 15T, a 60 helicopter repairer, but that would raise questions about why someone with specialized aviation training was working in a motor pool. "I've worked on various systems: mechanical, electrical, hydraulic." "That's still pretty vague, Rodriguez." Before Emma could respond, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a convoy of vehicles returning from a field exercise. The motors were loud and dusty, with obvious signs of hard use and several vehicles showing mechanical problems. "Looks like we're about to get busy," Tors announced. "Rodriguez, since you're apparently some kind of electrical wizard, why don't you take the lead on diagnosing any electrical issues that come in with these vehicles?" Emma nodded, grateful for the change of subject. As the convoy vehicles were directed to various repair bays, she could see multiple mechanical problems that would keep the motor pool busy for several days. The work would provide a welcome distraction from questions about her background and allow her to continue proving her competence through performance rather than explanations. But as she watched the dusty, battle-worn vehicles being positioned for maintenance, Emma couldn't help but remember other convoys, other maintenance facilities, other times when mechanical reliability had meant the difference between mission success and disaster. The familiar sights and sounds triggered memories she'd been trying to suppress since starting work at the motor pool. Emma pushed those thoughts away and focused on the present task. This was just routine maintenance on training vehicles, not life-or-death repairs on combat aircraft. The distinction was important for her psychological well-being, even if her coworkers didn't understand why someone with her apparent skills was content with such routine work. As the afternoon progressed, Emma threw herself into the diagnostic work, grateful for the opportunity to use her skills in a safe, controlled environment where the stakes were manageable and the work could be satisfying without being overwhelming. 3 weeks into her assignment at the motor pool, Emma had earned a reputation as the most skilled diagnostic mechanic in the unit. Her systematic approach to troubleshooting and her ability to solve complex problems that stumped other mechanics had gained her grudging respect from her coworkers, though they remained curious about her background. On Monday morning, Sergeant Torres approached her workstation with an unusual expression, part excitement, part concern. "Rodriguez, I've got a special project for you, something different from our usual work." Emma looked up from the engine she'd been working on. "What kind of project, Sergeant?" "We just got word that a VIP convoy is coming through next week. Some big shot from the Pentagon is visiting the base, and they want all escort vehicles inspected and certified by our best mechanics." "Okay, what makes it special?" Torres lowered his voice. "The vehicles are modified Humvees with special communications equipment and armor packages. Very expensive, very high-tech stuff. The kind of equipment that most mechanics never get to work on." Emma felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Modified vehicles with special equipment sounded too much like the kind of assets she'd worked on during her previous assignments, vehicles whose reliability was critical for mission success and personnel safety. "Why me, Sergeant? Wouldn't Specialist Martinez be better for that? He has more time in grade." "Martinez is good with basic maintenance, but this requires someone who understands complex systems and can think outside the box. Based on what I've seen from your work, you're the best diagnostic mechanic we've got." Emma wanted to decline the assignment, knowing that working on specialized military equipment might trigger memories and stress responses she'd been trying to avoid. But refusing would raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer. "When do they arrive?" "Tomorrow morning. The convoy commander wants a complete inspection of all systems, mechanical, electrical, communications, armor. Everything has to be perfect before they'll certify the vehicles for the VIP mission." "How many vehicles?" "4 Humvees plus 2 communications trucks. 6 vehicles total, and we have 3 days to complete all inspections and any necessary repairs." Emma nodded reluctantly. "I'll do my best, Sergeant." "I know you will. And Rodriguez, this is a big deal for our unit. If we do good work on this, it reflects well on the whole motor pool." The next morning, Emma arrived early to prepare for the arrival of the special convoy. When the vehicles rolled into the motor pool, she immediately recognized them as the kind of high-security assets used for sensitive military operations. The armor packages, communication antennas, and special equipment mountings were familiar from her previous work with Special Operations Aviation units. The convoy commander, a captain named Davis, gathered the motor pool personnel for a briefing. "These vehicles support critical missions," he explained. "Every system must function perfectly, and any problems need to be identified and corrected before we leave here." Captain Davis handed detailed inspection checklists to each mechanic. "These lists cover every component and system on these vehicles. I want thorough inspections and complete documentation of all work performed." Emma studied the checklist for her assigned vehicle and immediately recognized equipment she'd worked with before: encrypted communication systems, specialized navigation equipment, and electronic countermeasure devices. The familiarity was both reassuring and troubling, bringing back memories of similar equipment on aircraft that had carried her into some of the most dangerous places on Earth. As she began her inspection, Emma forced herself to focus on the technical requirements rather than the memories they triggered. The vehicle's communication systems were more sophisticated than anything normally found in a motor pool, requiring knowledge of classified procedures and specialized test equipment. "Rodriguez," called Specialist Johnson from the next bay, "what do you make of this radio setup? I've never seen anything like it." Emma glanced at Johnson's vehicle and immediately recognized the communication suite from her aviation experience. "It's a secure, tactical radio system, very sophisticated encryption and frequency management." "How do you know that? That's not standard motor pool equipment. Emma realized she'd revealed more familiarity with the equipment than she should have. I've seen similar systems before. The principles are pretty standard for military communications. Where would you see systems like this? These look like special operations equipment. Before Emma could answer, Captain Davis approached their work area. How are the inspections going? Fine, sir, Johnson replied, though Rodriguez seems to know more about this equipment than the rest of us. Davis studied Emma with interest. What's your background with communications equipment, Sergeant? I've worked on various systems, sir. Electronic troubleshooting principles are pretty universal. Maybe, but this equipment requires specific knowledge about secure communications protocols, not something most motor pool mechanics would be familiar with. Emma felt the familiar discomfort of having her knowledge questioned while simultaneously trying to avoid revealing too much about her background. I've had training on electronic systems, sir. Davis continued studying her with obvious curiosity. What kind of training? Advanced electronics courses, troubleshooting procedures, system integration. That's interesting. What unit were you with before this assignment? Emma hesitated, knowing that her actual previous assignment would raise far more questions than she was prepared to answer. I was at Fort Campbell, sir. Aviation support. Aviation support covers a lot of different jobs. What was your specific role? Electronic systems maintenance. Davis nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with her answers. Well, carry on with your inspection. Let me know if you find any problems with the communications equipment. As Davis walked away, Emma returned to her inspection with growing unease. The specialized equipment was triggering memories of aircraft systems she'd worked on during combat deployments, and the security requirements reminded her of missions where communication failures could have catastrophic consequences. About an hour into her inspection, Emma discovered a problem that made her stomach tighten with anxiety. The vehicle's primary communication antenna had a hairline crack in its mounting bracket that would likely cause system failure under vibration, exactly the kind of fault that could compromise mission security and personnel safety. Emma stared at the damaged component, remembering similar failures on aircraft that had led to communication blackouts during critical missions. The technical repair was straightforward, but the implications of the failure brought back memories of times when equipment problems had put lives at risk. "You okay, Rodriguez?" asked Johnson, who had noticed her standing motionless beside the vehicle. "Fine," Emma replied, forcing herself to focus on the present situation. "Just found a problem that needs attention." "What kind of problem?" "Cracked antenna mount. Could cause communication failure." Johnson examined the damage Emma had identified. "Wow, good catch. I never would have seen that crack. How did you spot it?" "Experience," Emma answered, gathering the tools she'd need to perform the repair. "You learn to look for stress patterns in critical components." "Where did you learn that kind of inspection technique? That's pretty advanced failure analysis." Emma was already removing the damaged component, using her work to avoid answering questions she didn't want to address. "You pick up things over time." As she worked on replacing the antenna mount, Emma tried to push away memories of similar repairs on aircraft that had been heading into combat zones. The technical procedures were identical, but the context was supposed to be different, routine maintenance rather than mission-critical repairs. But as she tested the repaired communication system and heard the familiar sounds of encrypted radio traffic, Emma realized that the distinction between her current assignment and her previous work was smaller than she'd hoped. The equipment might be mounted on trucks instead of helicopters, but the mission requirements were essentially the same. The recognition that she couldn't completely escape her military background, even in a motor pool assignment, left Emma feeling anxious and unsettled. She'd thought that working on simple mechanical systems would provide a safe distance from the high-stakes environment of her previous assignments. Instead, she was discovering that military service had a way of finding you, regardless of where you tried to hide. The inspection of the VIP convoy vehicles continued through Tuesday and into Wednesday, with Emma working methodically through complex systems that seemed increasingly familiar despite her attempts to treat them as routine maintenance. By Wednesday afternoon, all major systems had been checked and the necessary repairs completed, but Captain Davis had requested one final comprehensive test of all electronic systems before certifying the vehicles for the VIP mission. Emma was conducting the final communications check when disaster struck. While testing the encrypted radio system, she heard a transmission that made her blood run cold, an emergency alert from a training exercise that had gone wrong. A military helicopter had crashed during night training operations, and search and rescue teams were being mobilized immediately. The transmission wasn't meant for the convoy vehicles, but Emma's familiarity with military radio protocols allowed her to understand the gravity of the situation. Aircraft down, crew status unknown, immediate response required. It was exactly the kind of emergency that had defined her previous career. Emma stood frozen beside the radio, listening to the coordination traffic as rescue units organized their response. The professional calm of the radio operators couldn't hide the urgency of the situation or the fact that lives hung in the balance. "Rodriguez," called Sergeant Torres from across the garage. "You okay over there? You look like you've seen a ghost." Emma forced herself to respond. "I'm fine, Sergeant, just finishing the communications check." But she wasn't fine. The emergency radio traffic had triggered a cascade of memories from her own helicopter crash 2 years earlier. The sound of tearing metal, the smell of fuel and smoke, the weight of responsibility for crew members who hadn't survived. Her heart was racing, her palms were sweating, and she was finding it difficult to breathe normally. "The radio check is complete," she announced, her voice sounding strained even to herself. Captain Davis approached to review the final inspection results. "Any problems with the communication systems?" "No, sir. All systems are functioning within specifications." Davis studied her carefully. "Sergeant, are you feeling all right? You look pale." "I'm fine, sir. Just tired from the long inspection process." "Maybe you should take a break, get some fresh air." Emma nodded and walked quickly toward the exit, desperate to get away from the radio traffic that continued to detail the search and rescue operation. But as she reached the door, her legs gave out and she collapsed against the wall, overwhelmed by a panic attack that had been building since she first heard the emergency transmission. "Rodriguez," Torres rushed to her side as she slid down the wall to sit on the floor, struggling to control her breathing. "What's wrong? Should I call a medic?" "No," Emma managed between gasps. "Just need a minute." Several mechanics had gathered around, looking concerned and confused about what had triggered such a sudden collapse. Emma closed her eyes and tried to use the breathing techniques she'd learned in therapy, but the radio traffic from the emergency response was making it impossible to calm down. "Turn off the radio," she whispered. "What?" Torres asked. "The radio, turn it off, please." Johnson quickly switched off the communications equipment, and the garage fell silent except for the normal sounds of mechanical work. Emma's breathing began to slow as the trigger for her panic attack was removed. "Rodriguez," Torres said gently, "what just happened? Was it something you heard on the radio?" Emma nodded, still not trusting herself to speak normally. "Was it the helicopter crash, the emergency traffic?" "How did you know?" Emma asked, surprised that Torres had made the connection. "Because you reacted the exact moment that transmission came through. And because I've seen that kind of reaction before, from soldiers who have been through bad situations involving aircraft." Captain Davis had approached and was listening to the conversation with obvious concern. "Sergeant Rodriguez, have you been involved in a helicopter crash?" Emma looked up at the faces gathered around her. Mechanics who had become her coworkers, supervisors who were responsible for her well-being, and a convoy commander who was trying to understand what had just happened to one of his mechanics. "Yes, sir," she admitted quietly, "about 2 years ago." "Were you a passenger?" "No, sir, I was crew." Davis's expression changed immediately. "Crew? What kind of crew?" Emma realized that her carefully maintained anonymity was about to end. The panic attack had revealed more about her background than months of careful evasion. "Flight engineer, sir." "On what type of aircraft?" "A 60 Black Hawk, sir." Torres looked stunned. "Black Hawks, Rodriguez, you were a helicopter mechanic." "Flight engineer and crew chief," Emma corrected. "I maintained and operated aircraft systems during flight operations." Davis was studying her with new understanding. "Sergeant, what unit were you with?" Emma hesitated, knowing that revealing her actual unit would completely change how everyone viewed her. But the panic attack had already shattered her attempts at anonymity, and she was too emotionally drained to continue evading questions. 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, sir. The Night Stalkers." The garage fell completely silent. Every mechanic present knew the reputation of the 160th SOAR, the elite aviation unit that supported the military's most dangerous special operations missions. "Jesus Christ," whispered Johnson, "you're a Night Stalker." Davis's entire demeanor had changed. He was no longer looking at a motor pool mechanic who'd had a panic attack, but at a member of one of the military's most elite units. "Sergeant Rodriguez, why didn't you tell us about your background?" "Because I'm not that person anymore, sir," Emma replied, struggling to stand up. "That life ended when my helicopter went down." "What happened?" Emma took a deep breath, knowing that the full story would finally have to be told. "We were inserting a special operations team in Afghanistan, took heavy ground fire during the approach, lost power and auto-rotated into the landing zone. 2 crew members were killed. I spent 6 months in the hospital and another year in rehabilitation." Torres was shaking his head in amazement. "Rodriguez, you're telling me you've been working in my motor pool for 3 weeks, and you're actually one of the most elite aircraft mechanics in the military." "I was," Emma corrected. "Now I'm just someone trying to do simple work without having panic attacks." Captain Davis had been listening intently to the conversation. "Sergeant, I need to ask you something. Would you be willing to assist with the helicopter rescue operation? Your experience with crash recovery and emergency procedures could be valuable." The question hit Emma like a physical blow. She'd come to the motor pool specifically to avoid the high-stress situations that defined her previous career. "Sir, I can't. I'm not. I'm not ready for that kind of work anymore." "I understand," Davis said gently, "but if you change your mind, the offer stands." As the crowd of mechanics began to disperse, Emma remained sitting against the wall, emotionally exhausted by the revelation of her true background. She'd managed to keep her past secret for 3 weeks, but a single radio transmission had shattered her carefully maintained anonymity. Torres knelt down beside her. "Rodriguez, or should I say Night Stalker Rodriguez, are you going to be okay?" "I don't know, Sergeant. This is exactly what I was trying to avoid." "What do you mean?" "I came here to do simple work that wouldn't remind me of everything I lost when that helicopter went down. I wanted to fix trucks, not think about aircraft crashes or rescue operations." Torres was quiet for a moment before responding. "Rodriguez, can I tell you something? In my 20 years in the Army, I've never met anyone with your qualifications working in a motor pool. The fact that you're here, trying to rebuild your life after what you've been through, that takes more courage than flying any combat mission." Emma looked up at him with surprise. She'd expected judgment or pressure to return to aviation duties, not understanding and respect for her choice to step back. "I mean it," Torres continued. "You could have taken a medical discharge and walked away from the military entirely. Instead, you're here trying to find a way to continue serving despite everything you've been through. That's not failure, that's heroism." For the first time since the panic attack, Emma felt a glimmer of hope that maybe her new unit would understand and support her recovery, rather than pressuring her to return to her previous role. But as she heard the distant sound of helicopters heading toward the crash site, she realized that escaping her past might be more difficult than she'd imagined. The next morning, Emma arrived at the motor pool early, uncertain about how her coworkers would react after her emotional breakdown and the revelation of her elite military background. She'd spent a sleepless night wondering whether she should request a transfer to avoid the awkwardness of working with people who now knew far more about her past than she'd intended to share. As she entered the garage, Emma was surprised to find that the normal morning bustle had been replaced by an unusual quiet. The mechanics were working at their stations, but there was a subdued atmosphere that suggested something significant had happened. Sergeant Torres approached her immediately. "Rodriguez, I'm glad you're here. We need to talk." "About yesterday, Sergeant, if you think I'm not fit for duty." "Stop right there," Torres interrupted. "It's not about your fitness for duty. It's about something else entirely." He led her to his office, where Captain Davis was waiting with several other officers she didn't recognize. The formal atmosphere made Emma nervous, wondering if her panic attack had triggered some kind of investigation or disciplinary action. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Davis began, "I'd like you to meet Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment and Major Parks from Army Personnel Command." Emma came to attention, recognizing Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell as someone from her old unit. Mitchell stood and extended his hand with obvious warmth and respect. "Emma, it's good to see you again. I've been tracking your progress since you left us." "Sir, I didn't expect to see anyone from the regiment here. I was at Fort Hood for other meetings when I heard about yesterday's incident. I wanted to check on you personally." Emma felt a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "I'm sorry about the panic attack, sir. It won't happen again." "Emma, you have nothing to apologize for. PTSD is a normal response to abnormal situations, and what you experienced was as abnormal as it gets." Major Parks stepped forward. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I'm here because we've received some unusual reports about your performance at this motor pool. Apparently, you've been solving complex mechanical problems that have stumped other mechanics." "I've just been doing my job, ma'am." "According to the reports I've seen, you've been doing much more than that. Your diagnostic skills and system knowledge are apparently far beyond what would be expected from someone in this assignment." Torres spoke up. "Ma'am, Rodriguez fixed an electrical problem that 3 other mechanics couldn't solve, and her work on the VIP convoy vehicles was flawless, even with equipment she'd supposedly never seen before." Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell smiled. "That sounds like the Emma Rodriguez I remember. She was one of our most gifted flight engineers, with an intuitive understanding of aircraft systems that couldn't be taught." "Sir," Emma said quietly, "that was before the crash. I'm not that person anymore." "Emma, yesterday's incident doesn't change your core abilities. You still have the same technical knowledge and problem-solving skills that made you valuable to the regiment." Captain Davis had been listening to the conversation with growing understanding. "Sergeant Rodriguez, yesterday when you had the panic attack, I thought about asking you to help with the helicopter rescue operation. I decided against it because you seemed too distressed, but now I'm wondering if I made the wrong choice." "What do you mean, sir?" "The rescue operation was successful, but it took 6 hours to locate and extract the crew from the crashed helicopter. An experienced flight engineer might have been able to predict the crash site location and reduce the search time significantly. Emma felt a familiar tug of responsibility. During her time with the 160th, she'd participated in numerous search and rescue operations, using her knowledge of aircraft systems and crash dynamics to help locate downed aircraft quickly. "Sir, I wanted to help, but I wasn't sure I could handle the stress. What if there was a way for you to contribute without putting yourself in high-stress situations?" asked Major Parks. "I don't understand, ma'am." Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell leaned forward. "Emma, we have a proposal for you. What if you could use your expertise to help train other people in crash analysis and recovery procedures, without having to participate in actual emergency operations?" Training. Teaching other flight engineers and rescue personnel how to analyze crash sites, predict wreckage locations, and understand aircraft system failures. Your experience is valuable, and there aren't many people who can teach those skills effectively. Emma considered the proposal. Teaching might allow her to contribute her knowledge without exposing herself to the triggers that caused her panic attacks. Where would this training take place? "Here at Fort Hood, initially," Major Parks explained. "We're establishing a new training center for crash investigation and recovery procedures. You could develop curriculum and train personnel from multiple services." "But I'm not qualified to be an instructor. I'm just a sergeant with PTSD." Torres shook his head firmly. "Rodriguez, you're not just anything. You're one of the most experienced flight engineers in the military, and your mechanical knowledge is extraordinary. The fact that you're dealing with PTSD doesn't diminish your qualifications. It gives you additional perspective that could help other people." Captain Davis nodded in agreement. "Sergeant, your diagnostic skills are the best I've ever seen. You could teach those techniques to mechanics and engineers who might never have the chance to learn from someone with your experience." Emma looked around the room at the faces watching her. Officers who respected her abilities, supervisors who had seen her competence, and a mentor from her old unit who understood both her capabilities and her limitations. "What would my role be exactly?" Major Parks consulted a folder she'd brought. "You'd be assigned as a senior instructor at the new training center. Your responsibilities would include developing curriculum for crash analysis, teaching diagnostic procedures to military mechanics, and consulting on complex system failures. And I wouldn't have to participate in actual emergency operations." "Not unless you chose to," Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell assured her. "The goal is to use your knowledge in a way that's sustainable for your mental health while still serving the military's needs." Emma felt a spark of interest that had been missing since her medical retirement from flight status. The opportunity to teach and share her knowledge appealed to her, and the controlled environment would be much less stressful than operational assignments. When would this start? "The training center is scheduled to open in 6 months, Major Parks explained. "That would give you time to complete your recovery here and prepare for the transition to instructor duties." "And I could continue working in the motor pool until then?" "Absolutely," Torres said immediately. "In fact, we'd like you to start developing some training materials while you're here. Your work with our mechanics could serve as a pilot program for the larger training center." Emma looked at Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell. "Sir, what do you think, honestly?" "Honestly, I think this assignment could be perfect for you. You get to use your expertise in a way that helps other people, but without the operational stress that triggers your PTSD. And Emma, there's one more thing." "What's that, sir?" Mitchell smiled. "The military needs people who understand both the technical aspects of complex systems and the human cost of failure. Your experience gives you that understanding in ways that can't be taught from books." Emma felt tears forming as she realized that her military career wasn't ending. It was transforming into something that might be even more meaningful than her previous role. "I accept," she said quietly. The room erupted in handshakes and congratulations, but Emma's attention was drawn to a small detail she just noticed. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell was wearing a flight suit with a patch on the back that she recognized, a memorial patch for crew members lost in the crash that had ended her flying career. "Sir," she said, pointing to the patch, "you're still carrying them with you." Mitchell nodded solemnly. "We all are, Emma. Their sacrifice means something, and so does yours. You survived that crash for a reason, and I think this new assignment might be part of that reason." As the meeting concluded and plans were made for her transition to instructor duties, Emma realized that her time in the motor pool had been exactly what she'd needed, a chance to rebuild her confidence and discover that her value as a soldier extended far beyond her ability to fly dangerous missions. She would always carry the scars from that crash in Afghanistan, but she was finally ready to carry its lessons forward in service of others who might face similar challenges. The broken Night Stalker was ready to fly again, just in a different way.